Well, 2 months after NATO strikes killed 24 Pakistani soldiers, and after an official Pentagon investigation, reports say that the Obama administration is actively considering issuing an apology, or at least an expression of contrition. Now, it would be a rare move, and it makes us think of the many civilian casualties of U.S. drone strikes for which there are no apologies, let alone figures released, considering that the CIA doesn't publicly discuss its program. But the civilian tolls not only felt in Pakistan, but at other countries where we wage shadow wars as well. So today, let's talk about Yemen. In a new piece for The Nation magazine, Jeremy Scahill takes a look at internal conflict in Yemen and how U.S. counterterrorism policy has not only been taken advantage of as a cash cow for the Saleh regime, but how it's also strengthening the very threat that it seeks to eliminate: Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. So joining me to discuss it is Jeremy Scahill, national security correspondent for The Nation magazine. Jeremy, thanks so much for joining us tonight. And I guess I'm just going to start with the way that you start off your piece. You start by focusing on an area called Zinjibar, and you say that really the Yemeni forces' attempts to take it back was a turning point, a very incredible, important test for Saleh's regime. So tell us why it is that that holds so much significance.
Well, let's remember that President Obama began bombing Yemen less than a year into his presidency. The first U.S. airstrike authorized by Obama was in December of 2009. And it was not a drone strike, actually. It was a cruise missile strike launched from the ocean, and it slammed into a very poor, remote Bedouin village. And it was allegedly aimed at Al-Qaeda members, but in reality, the people that were killed were more than 40 poor Bedouins that lived in this very remote area. And in fact, this episode became somewhat infamous around the world because in the WikiLeaks cables, it was revealed that General David Petraeus, who at the time was the CENTCOM commander, actually went to Yemen, met with President Ali Abdullah Saleh after this missile strike, and the two of them conspired to cover it up. In fact, Saleh said, "We'll continue to say that the bombs are ours and not yours." And so that kicked off a string of airstrikes that President Obama authorized, some of which hit the intended targets and others hitting civilians or killing important tribal leaders or opponents of Saleh's regime. So I put all of that out there in response to your question because you have to understand the context of what we're going to talk about when we talk about what's going on in Zinjibar in the south of Yemen right now is 3 years of sustained airstrikes where a lot of civilians have been killed. And even in cases where the so-called right person has been killed, Yemenis don't like the fact that the U.S. is bombing their country. And so in May of last year, a group calling itself Ansar al-Sharia, the supporters of Sharia law, essentially marched into town in Zinjibar, which is the capital of Abyan province, and they chased away the local authorities and they declared themselves the rulers of this town, and they did it in a number of areas. And when the U.S. funded units who were responsible for fighting counterterrorism were confronted with this group coming in, they simply fled and they left behind their weapons that the U.S. had provided them. And then when the Yemeni military, not trained by the United States, not supported by the Saleh family, was tasked with trying to clear the city, these militants from Ansar al-Sharia took the U.S. weapons and started to shell the Yemeni national forces. And some analysts that I spoke to in Yemen believe that the Saleh regime allowed these guys to come in and take the city to sort of send a message to the United States that if you allow me to leave or if you push for my departure, and I'm talking to you from New York right now, and Ali Abdullah Saleh is in New York at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, he was trying to basically say to the United States, I'm the only guy who can fight terror in Yemen, and if without me, this is what's going to happen across the country. The problem is, from a U.S. perspective, this is really blowback. Whether or not Saleh allowed it to happen, whether or not Ansar al-Sharia is actually just a crude sort of front for Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, has become irrelevant because the political ideas of Ansar al-Sharia, very conservative Islamic ideas, Sharia law imposed with violence on a population, has brought law and order and has gained support of tribal leaders who are quite simply fed up with U.S. airstrikes and the U.S. support for the Saleh kleptocracy and all the brutality that comes with it.
Let me break in here for a second, too, right? Because you're talking about just Saleh, who wants to send a message to the Obama administration, to the U.S., that we can't do this without him. But do you also think that those U.S.-trained forces are taking advantage of the U.S.? I mean, does it only come from higher up, or does it also work on a lower level? You write about this in your piece, that this is perhaps a cash cow, that they're exploiting this and letting the situation get worse on purpose.
Right. I mean, well, let's remember too that it was under President Bush's time in power that the United States began funding, arming, and training these so-called counterterrorism units that are run by Saleh's son, Ahmed Ali, who's the head of the Republican Guard, and then Yahya Saleh, who's the head of the counterterrorism unit. The idea behind it was that these forces were going to fight al-Qaeda, and they were going to work with the United States, and that's why they were going to be given all this funding and all this weaponry and all of this training. Many people in Yemen say they've never actually fought any terrorists, that their entire purpose is to defend the regime. And so, yeah, I think that, it's to their benefit to have the perception that there's this huge problem with terrorism and terrorists in Yemen. But I also think that, so I think you're right in what you're saying, but I also think that they kind of played the United States and they played the terrorism card. There's been more prison breaks in Yemen than there were, than that crew from that Fox News show, Prison Break, broke out of prison. I mean, Michael Schofield, the main character of that show, must be working for al-Qaeda because they're breaking out of prison like every week. And lo and behold, they break out of prison as soon as the Yemeni government wants more counterterrorism funding. So, this is a very complicated game, and I think that American officials are quite arrogant when they meet with, leaders of very poor countries. And I think they always thought they were smarter than Saleh, and he's a better chess player than John Brennan and the other American officials he deals with.
Well, what do you think at the end of the day, right? Because a lot of this has to do, it ends up being a vicious circle, right? They don't like the fact, and I don't blame them, rightly so, that U.S. airstrikes are killing civilians and wreaking havoc, right, in Yemen on local populations. At the same time, they see Saleh allowing this to happen, backing it, and so they end up going elsewhere. And for now, it might be going to al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. But do you think that if the U.S. had no presence there at all, would we be better off?
Well, that's certainly what a lot of Yemenis told me, including Yemenis that are very pro-American. And they say that if the U.S. had just left us alone, we'd probably have less terrorism in Yemen than we do today. I mean, I certainly think that while the United States or the Obama administration may be very proud of the fact that, for instance, they killed Anwar al-Awlaki, who's, of course, a U.S. citizen, and Samir Khan, who was killed along with him, who's also a U.S. citizen, let's remember that 2 weeks later, the U.S. military and CIA forces killed 16-year-old Abdurrahman al-Awlaki, who was Anwar al-Awlaki's 16-year-old son, also a U.S. citizen. So we've killed 3 U.S. citizens in a 2-week period. And when I would ask Yemenis about that, they would say to me, well, what about the 40-something Bedouins that Obama killed? Or what about the governor of Marib province who was killed in an airstrike? And they're saying, you all focus on the Americans. We're focused on our people that you're killing. You say that these guys are terrorists. We say your drones are terrorism. So, I do think that the United States needs to back away from this idea that you can engage in this cruise missile or drone strike fueled war of attrition and kill the finite number of bad guys in the world, because that's just not the way it works. We're creating more enemies. So at the end of the day, I think the Yemenis who say there would have been less terrorism had the U.S. not done this they're probably right, and I think that's a defensible position, and it should inform some U.S. policy going forward. We don't learn from our horrid mistakes. I mean, look at the disaster in Afghanistan right now. What's the end of that going to be? The Taliban have to be brought to the table because they have indigenous support in some of these areas. The U.S. is so afraid of the word Islam that they are pushing aside perhaps the only political forces in these countries that could stabilize them. These are religious countries. There's going to be some religious form of governance in it that is indigenous to people. So, the U.S. needs to back away from just thinking you can kill your way to peace and start negotiating with the people that actually can bring some form of stability in these countries.
Well, you bring that up too, and in your piece, you're talking to one of the tribal leaders there who says that why don't we get paid by the U.S., right? They pay it after the Lockerbie bombing, and so why can't we get some kind of compensation for that? Do you think that that's a good idea? Would that fix anything, or what is the way forward?
No, I mean, it's kind of funny, and you and I have talked about a variety of countries that sort of dot the landscape of these undeclared wars that the Obama administration is waging. And in every country that I've sort of been in the last year or so, in Afghanistan, in Somalia, and elsewhere, sometimes people think I'm a CIA person and they want to sort of cut a deal with me or ask me, why I stopped paying them, or they want to, send a message. And in Yemen, it was no different. Where I met with several tribal leaders who said, why doesn't the U.S. put us on the payroll like they did with the awakening councils in Iraq? As people study history, they see what happens elsewhere. Everyone's running their angle, but that I think is a very dangerous slope that you can start falling down back into 1980s style Contra stuff, where you start arming all these local forces. And the U.S. doesn't have any credible intelligence on the ground in Yemen, and the last thing they need to do is start putting a bunch of sheikhs on the payroll, and they don't know where their weapons are going to go or where the money is going to go.
Well, I guess everybody wants the money, though, right? When they've seen the examples from the past, though. But so you mentioned the fact that we need our government leaders, we need our military officials to actually pay attention to what they're doing. But how do you get average people to also be interested, the average American, right? If what you're laying out here, and it's not something that has not been argued before, is that our counterterrorism policies are in fact only making things worse, then how do you get the public to put pressure on it? There was just this poll last week that says that the majority of Americans actually support the Obama administration's use of the drone program. They also said that in the case of going after American citizens, but if they knew this information, would they still feel that way?
I mean, it's not just the majority of Americans. It was 83% of Americans, including 77% of people that considered themselves liberal Democrats. So, I mean, what that says to me is that this administration has normalized assassination as a staple of U.S. foreign policy, for a whole generation of liberals. And the fact is that the poll numbers dropped only slightly when they were asked about U.S. citizens. They did drop. I think those of us that are really kind of trying to shout in the dark about this and say, look, if we don't stop these policies, it's going to make us less safe. It's going to result in a boomerang effect of terrorism. I think we're fighting a very uphill battle here. And part of it, it's people don't like to talk about this in any real way when it comes to the war issue. Congress is bought. They're bought by the war industry. Democrats are afraid. They want to be able to seem tough. Drones are a good way of saying we're just killing the bad guys, and Obama's drawing down in Iraq and Afghanistan. It has everything to do with the economic crisis in this country as well, and what we've seen with members of Congress being purchased by the pharmaceutical lobby, by the mortgage industry, by huge banks, by hedge funds, by Wall Street. It's all connected. The same thing is true of the war industry and the sort of counterterrorism industrial complex out there. So, I don't have any illusions that the things that I'm saying tonight are going to somehow be adopted by the White House. But I will say that very serious people within the intelligence community, behind closed doors, know very well that what I'm saying is of great concern to these operations. And someday there will be whistleblowers, and they'll probably be prosecuted by this administration, that are going to come out and say the whole thing was a disaster.
I don't doubt that at all. Let me just ask you one last question, too, because today happens to be a year since we saw protests start in Libya. We know how that ended up with Gaddafi being taken out, and it's still a mess. And now we have Republican lawmakers that are calling on the Obama administration to directly intervene in Syria and to help arm the opposition. What's your take on that?
Well, I think in the case of Libya, we have to remember that there was a revolt in Libya that was somewhere between a popular uprising and a civil war. But the fact is that Muammar Gaddafi, who of course was just as ruthless of a tyrant and a dictator when he was hanging out with John McCain in his tent, when relations were being normalized by the Bush administration with him, as he was when this uprising happened against him, his regime was overthrown by NATO. This was not a Mubarak situation where the people brought him down. Muammar Gaddafi was brought down in a NATO affected or implemented regime change. In Syria, I think you have a situation where there is a much wider rebellion going on. I do think that there is a civil war happening there. I think that the Free Syrian Army is becoming more and more mobilized. I think the United States would be playing a very dangerous game by getting involved with arming or funding anyone within Syria. At the same time, I think that Bashar al-Assad is a ruthless, murderous dictator, and I would love to see him go. But I don't believe in regime change at the barrel of an American or a NATO gun. And so, it's a challenge to all of us. I want the slaughter to end in Syria. I have Syrian friends. I do believe that Assad is a vicious, brutal murderer. But I don't think that means the United States has the right to run around the world and overthrow governments because it becomes, popular to do so.
All right, Jeremy, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.